Welcome to E-Bible Fellowship's Evening Bible Studies with your host and Bible teacher, Chris McCann. For more studies, visit our website at www.ebiblefellowship.org. And now, here's Chris McCann.
Hello and welcome to E-Bible Fellowship's Bible study in the book of Genesis. Tonight is study number 17 in Genesis chapter 40, and I'll begin with verse 10. And in the vine were 3 branches, and it was as though it budded, and her blossoms shot forth, and the clusters thereof brought forth ripe grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said unto him, This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thine head and restore thee unto thy place. And thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand after the former manner when thou wast his butler. Okay. So the vine has 3 branches. Verse 12 reveals the interpretation. The interpretation, which belongs to God, that the 3 branches are 3 days. And again, it's God's prerogative, it's his good pleasure to define his own terms. It's his word. It's the word from his kingdom. And I mean, the problems facing the individual who comes to the Bible and tries to take it literally, just insurmountable. You'll get nowhere. You'll get nowhere. And just as Christ spoke parables, gave interpretation. So God is interpreting the dream. And by the way, this also would mean anywhere down the line if we're reading of a number of branches. Now, it so happens, I think with the candlestick, they had 3 branches on one side and 3 branches on another side. And I'm not sure how to relate that to what's being said here, but you have to take it into consideration. You have to think, well, is it 3 days? Something to do with that? It's how we learn, how we have God define various words as Jesus explains parables, or as we compare spiritual with spiritual, sometimes definitions appear. And our vocabulary, biblical vocabulary, is increasing. Well, in this case, we want to look at 3 days. We want to start seeing what the Bible has to say about 3 days. And you may not be aware that the Bible has a lot to say about 3 days. It's mentioned even in Exodus. We'll look at some scriptures, and we're going to find, I think, some answers to a couple of verses that have kind of, I don't want to say troubled me, perplexed me is probably a better word, because I've been looking at it for a while, trying to understand them. And it so happened, I don't know how long ago, maybe 2-3 months ago, a caller called in to eBible's New Open Forum program and brought up some things that were very helpful in understanding the references. We'll Lord willing, get to those verses probably the next study, because we want to look at the 3 days, and there's a lot of information related to the 3 days that will tie into these other scriptures that are in the New Testament. But we're going to start, well, we'll also look at some verses in the New Testament in this study, but I just want to go slow, and then hopefully we'll build up and we'll have an understanding of what's being said in those other verses. Okay, let's begin by going to Exodus 10, Exodus chapter 10, and we'll read verses 22 and 23. Exodus 10 says in verse 22, and Moses, well, no, I'm sorry, I'll start in verse 21. And Jehovah said unto Moses, stretch out thine hand toward heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, even darkness which may be felt. And Moses stretched forth his hand toward heaven, and there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt 3 days. They saw not one another, neither rose any from his place for 3 days, but all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. Okay, so this is one of God's plagues upon Egypt when Israel were still captives. They were still bondwomen in service to Pharaoh. And so one of the plagues, God sent this thick darkness for 3 days. And so we can see 3 days, well, we would say identifies with judgment, because all the plagues were judgments upon Egypt, judgments upon Pharaoh, Pharaoh a type of Satan, Egypt a type of the world, and 3 days of wrath is what the darkness would represent. Of course, this in one way we can relate to our present Judgment Day period, or even when judgment began at the house of God, because God took away the light of the gospel from the church to begin with, and there was darkness. You could use the expression thick darkness in the churches and congregations. And interestingly, the way darkness works itself out spiritually is through a darkness of understanding. There's a verse in Ephesians chapter 4. Some of you probably heard this before. I quote it fairly regularly. Ephesians 4, verses 17 and 18. This I say, therefore, and testify in the Lord, that ye henceforth walk not as other Gentiles walk, in the vanity of their mind, having the understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them because of the blindness of their heart. So when God judges an entity like the church, previously Christ was in the midst of the congregations. He was that light of the candlestick that gave the church light. He's the essence of light. And then when God began judgment at the house of God, the Spirit of Christ departed out, and the light left, leaving the church in darkness. This is represented in Revelation chapter 8, where the Lord speaks of judgment on the third part, and the third part is a reference to the corporate church. And we read in Revelation 8, verse 12, and the fourth angel or fourth messenger sounded, and the third part of the sun was smitten, and the third part of the moon, and the third part of the stars, so as the third part of them was darkened, and the day shone not for a third part of it, and the night likewise. And don't think, well, if the third part of the sun, that means two-thirds is shining. No, the third part is the designation for the entire corporate body, the entire church, all denominations in the world. So if the third part is darkened, then they have complete darkness. Complete darkness. See, later on, in Matthew 24, we read immediately after the tribulation, the sun was dark and the moon did not give its light and the stars fell. And you see, it doesn't say the third part of the sun, third part of the moon, or third part of the stars there like it does here. That's how God has, made it possible for us to distinguish, who's the object of his wrath. Third part, it's the church, the object of his wrath. Matthew 24:29, that's the light of the gospel, sun, moon, stars, celestial lights. When that God established, the Bible established, that's the light of the gospel in all the world, all the world. So first, judgment begins at the house of God, at the church. Third part is darkened. And you could actually say, okay, if you want to use that figure of 2/3, the 2/3 identifies with man, and man could identify with the nations, and God sent the latter rain to the nations. So there was the light of the gospel, brilliant light that was shining for about 17 years of the latter rain period. And God saved the great multitude. Then immediately after the tribulation, that's after the rain, the latter rain concludes, 23-year great tribulation concludes, the sun is darkened. The sun is darkened. That's the whole world. So we know this darkening, and remember Ephesians 4, understanding darkened. And you see, once God departs, he's wisdom, he's knowledge, he's the light, then the natural men who were the overwhelming vast majority of the churches to begin with, that remain in the congregations, God eventually calls his people out. We start coming out. The wise, the elect would have been serving to as a buffer at least, or a slowing process on the doctrinal madness and evil that would just take off once Christ departed, and then once he calls his people out, there's no one to say to the pastor, elder, or deacon, now you said this in your sermon. What about this verse? What about that verse? See, they're not being confronted. They're lesson there. Of course, there could be an occasional chair in the congregation who would bring up a verse, but it wouldn't be the same. And the elect having that ear to hear, the tares just simply don't have ears to hear. So it wouldn't bother them to the degree it would bother the elect, and the elect would often be vocal or just wanting clarity. But now they're gone. Now they're gone. So the darkness becomes a thick darkness, and it impacts understanding. And this is why you get things like the tongues movement spreading to hundreds of millions of professed Christians, when that is another gospel, complete other gospel. They're adding to the word of God, saying God communicated with me. It's a violation of Revelation 22:18-19, and it's why you get falling over backwards, calling it slain in the spirit and thinking it's a good thing, a positive thing, a sign you have the Spirit. No, it's a sign of what you said. You're being slain by the Spirit. It's a judgment of God. And who could imagine that people would think in any kind of way that falling over in the aisles with holy laughter was of God? It's so obvious that that's a mockery, that that is the activity of Satan to mock the gospel, the pure word of God, and just on and on and on with the blindness, and the women started to get more and more into the pulpits, more and more teaching directly against First Timothy 2 that says, I suffer not a woman to teach nor usurp authority over the man. And just anything and everything you can think of, worshiping the sun, moon, stars, practically. Homosexual bishops, when the sin of homosexuality is forbidden, and actually to be a bishop or an elder or a pastor, there's qualifications. You have to be the husband of one wife, a woman. That's the only true marriage, is between a man and a woman. And you can't even be divorced. It has to be one wife, and anyone who divorces and marries another, you have two wives. And of course the marriage institution was trampled underfoot, just awful. You know it as well as I. This is the darkness. Once the light departs, the judgment of God, typified by 3 days, the 3 days can represent God's judgment, and there it is in the churches and congregations. And then on May 21, 2011, judgment transitions to the world, the whole world. And all of a sudden, more and more nations, governments are declaring, well, yes, it's a good thing for men to marry men. It's freedom, it's liberty, and who can stand in the way of love? Well, love is always defined in the Bible by keeping God's commandments, and any activity that does not keep God's commandments is not love, whether it's sexual immorality between a man and a woman, or sexual immorality between men or between women. It's sexual immorality. It is disobedience to the commandments of God. And there is no actual marriage between men and men and women in God's sight. God is the one who originated the marriage institution back in the Garden of Eden when he made Eve from Adam's rib, and he joined them together. And what God has joined together, let not man put asunder. And the marriage relationship always is a picture of Christ the bridegroom and the elect, all who are saved, the bride. We are cast as the female, and Christ is in the figure of the husband, the male. And so if you have two males, that it just violates the whole spiritual picture that God establishes, even when it's a man marrying a second or a third time due to divorce, and it is adultery, yet still that maintains that spiritual picture of man and woman, whereas same sex, it never gets started. It never gets started. It just cannot be. And if you have two women, then it's like the elect and the elect in the spiritual realm, and that doesn't paint the proper picture. It doesn't begin. That's why, of course, marriage of the world is lawful in the world by the governments, but it has no lawful standing, no biblical standing in the kingdom of God. So they're not married in God's sight, just as in the world, they say you can divorce. It's legal to divorce. You can have justices and get your divorce, and you have all the paperwork. You're legally divorced. You can legally marry another. In the eyes of the world, yeah, sure, anything goes in the world, but in the eyes of God, you're still married. You're still married to the one the world says you're divorced from. And it's God's law is the supreme law, the superior law, and he doesn't change because men lose sight of good and start calling good evil and evil good. God doesn't go along with the change. Men change things in order to rectify their problem of sinfulness. And the law of God says this is sin. Well, let's change it here. Okay, we have our Supreme Court, and our Supreme Court says this, and now it's the law of the land. No more sin. Well, you're kidding yourself. You're fooling yourself, because it's still sin. Nothing's changed in God's sight. It's still desperate wickedness, and so the darkness that has overtaken the world, we can see it since May 21, 2011, with the transgenderism issues, men, the confusion of not knowing, or thinking, a man thinking he's a woman thinking she's a man, and all the confusion it's caused in society. How we wonder, how could this be? Because typically very low numbers of people, historically or traditionally, had this kind of issue, and how can it be now? It's gotten to the point where governments are so determined to make it law, to change everything, even grammar. Some people want to be called they, or the whole pronoun issue. How can it be? The understanding is darkened. Since May 21, 2011, the light of the gospel went out. This is Christ, who is the essence of light, departing from the world, not from his elect. Remember that verse in Exodus: there was thick darkness in Egypt, but the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. So the light of Christ is still within the great multitude of elect left on the earth, but the darkness has impacted the understanding of the secular world. So there's secular doctrine. This is what governments develop. The laws is secular doctrine. The church develops biblical law of religious doctrine, and secular government develops secular doctrine. And just as the church before them, judgment began there, and the religious doctrine, the Bible's teaching, doctrine means teaching, just they lost sight. They went way off course, crazy. Just, they went nuts in blindness, in the fact that their understanding was darkened concerning the true teaching of the Bible. The world doesn't concern itself directly with the Bible. No, its doctrine is basically, that moral code written upon the heart of every human being. And so there we see it. How can anyone explain, for the whole history of the world, men did not marry men, nor women marry women, or men knew they were women, men knew they were men, and women knew they were women, and now all of a sudden they don't? How's that happen? And especially at this time, in the time of the judgment of the world is the object of the wrath of God, just like the church before it. And so we can learn from God's judgment on the church, the loss of understanding. Not only a loss, but it's to hold positions such as, and it's getting worse and worse, that the killing of babies is a good and right and moral thing. And but they actually think they're being, they have the moral high ground because they hold this position. That's how much their understanding, the moral law, the moral code that the Lord implanted within people is in the dark. It is a thick darkness that can be felt. It's so incredible. And yet we see it happening. We see it. It's perfectly in line. We should expect it with the spiritual judgment God has brought on the world since May 21, 2011. But this will probably be a series of studies till we really get into this whole issue of 3 days, and I hope you'll be able to join us for all these studies, because I think we're going to get some answers. We're going to get an answer, I believe, to Hosea chapter 6. 2 days he will revive us. The third day he will raise us up, and some New Testament scriptures today, tomorrow, and the third day. Remember that? And I, by God's grace, I think we'll have some harmony between these verses.
Thank you for joining us for E-Bible Fellowship's Evening Bible Studies with your host and Bible teacher, Chris McCann. For more studies and information, visit our website at www.ebiblefellowship.org. Until our next Bible study, may the Lord's perfect will be done.